The sirens didn't blare. They whined. It was a pathetic, dying animal sound that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled Jonathan's back teeth. When he finally hauled himself out of the sanitation sub-closet, the corridors weren't filled with screaming crewmen or the sharp bark of commanders. They were empty. The Sovereign Dawn was a ghost ship, bleeding atmosphere and cooking itself from the inside out. They had left him. Now Jonathan had two choices: burn quietly or get to work. The smell was the first thing that registered as wrong. Usually, Deck 4 smelled like a clinical mixture of synthetic lemon solvent and the sour, ammonia-laced sweat of the Valyrians. It was a sterile, sharp odor that Jonathan had spent the last 8 months trying to scrub out of his nasal cavity. But today, right at the end of his shift, the lemon was gone. The ammonia was gone. Instead, the air tasted like hot copper and burnt dust. Jonathan leaned his mop against the gray composite bulkhead and wiped a forearm across his forehead. He was a man built for gravity, carrying an extra 20 pounds of weight around his middle and a permanent ache in his left knee. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit that rode up too high on the ankles, currently stained with the grayish sludge that accumulated in the ship's primary ventilation filters. He waited for the shift change klaxon. It didn't come. Instead, the deck vibrated. It wasn't the steady, reassuring thrum of the ship's massive dark matter engines pushing them through the void. It was a jagged, arrhythmic shudder. Thump, pause, thump, thump, groan. "Hey!" Jonathan called out. His voice sounded flat, instantly swallowed by the long, curved corridor. "Any of you geckos up there going to tell me what's broken this time?" Silence. Not just the absence of voices, but the absence of life. The ship's ambient noise, the clicking of the Valyrians' clawed feet, the hiss of the pneumatic doors, the low hum of the life support recyclers, had vanished. Only that dying, whining siren remained, looping endlessly in the distance. Jonathan's knee popped as he bent down to pick up his toolkit. A heavy canvas bag filled with wrenches, duct tape, industrial sealant, and a few illicit protein bars. He slung it over his shoulder, the strap digging into his collarbone. He walked down the corridor toward the midship mess hall. The lights overhead flickered, shifting from their standard harsh white to a dim, sickly amber. Emergency power. When the pneumatic doors of the mess hall slid open, hissing weakly, struggling to part, Jonathan froze. The vast room was abandoned, but it hadn't been packed up. Trays of half-eaten nutrient paste sat on the steel tables. A spilled cup of something purple and viscous was slowly dripping off the edge of a bench, pooling onto the grating below. Drip, drip, drip. Jonathan walked over to the nearest table. The purple liquid was still warm. "Okay," Jonathan muttered, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Okay, this is a joke. Real funny, guys. The janitor fell asleep in the closet again. Let's leave him in the dark." He didn't believe it. The Valyrians didn't have a sense of humor. They were a rigid, hyper-logical species. They didn't do pranks. They did schedules, protocols, and efficiency. Leaving a mess behind was entirely against their nature. A knot formed in Jonathan's stomach. A heavy, cold rock of dread. He walked over to the central communication terminal mounted on the wall. He tapped the glass. It flared to life, casting a harsh orange glow across his face. He bypassed the Valyrian script. He couldn't read the damn squiggles anyway, and pulled up the ship's universal schematic, a visual map he used to track plumbing leaks. The ship was outlined in blue, except for Sector 7. Sector 7 was the main engineering bay, housing the dark matter core. It was pulsing a violent, angry red. Jonathan squinted, tapping the screen with a calloused, grease-stained finger. The text translated into blunt, unfeeling English. Core temperature threshold exceeded. Coolant loop. Critical failure. Estimated time to containment breach, 47 minutes. Protocol 81A enacted. Jonathan knew what Protocol 81A was. He had had to read the manual during his orientation. Total evacuation. His finger drifted across the screen to the hangar bays. Escape pods launched. 42/42. Current onboard personnel. 1. Jonathan stared at the number. 1. He didn't scream. He didn't drop to his knees and curse the heavens. The reaction that bubbled up inside him was far uglier and far more pedestrian. It was pure, unadulterated annoyance, quickly followed by a suffocating wave of panic. They left him. He had been down in the sub-closet, scrubbing a calcified grease trap for 3 hours out of the main comms loop, and they had just left. He wasn't essential personnel. He was Jonathan Paul, Class 4 sanitation, a rounding error on the ship's manifest. He backed away from the screen. His breathing hitched, becoming shallow and rapid. He looked at the spilled purple drink. He looked at the flickering amber lights. 47 minutes until the dark matter core ate through its containment field and turned the sovereign dawn, and Jonathan into a cloud of superheated plasma. He walked over to a chair, pulled it out, and sat down. The metal was cold against his thighs. He unzipped his toolkit, rummaged past a heavy pipe wrench, and pulled out a squished, foil-wrapped protein bar. He unwrapped it with shaking hands and took a bite. It tasted like cardboard and stale chocolate. 47 minutes, he said, to the empty room, chewing slowly. He could just sit here. He could eat his stale chocolate, maybe find a bottle of the captain's private reserve liquor, and wait for the flash. It wouldn't hurt. It would be too fast to hurt. He took another bite. The ship groaned again, a deep structural protest against the heat building in its belly. Jonathan swallowed. The rock in his gut hardened into something else. Spite. "Screw that," he whispered. He tossed the half-eaten bar onto the table, grabbed his toolkit, and stood up. He didn't know anything about dark matter physics, but he knew machinery, and he knew that if a pipe was jammed, you didn't run away. You grabbed a bigger wrench. The descent to Sector 7 was a study in sensory degradation. With the main elevators locked down under emergency protocols, Jonathan had to take the maintenance shafts. These were narrow, vertical tubes lined with rusted rungs that smelled perpetually of ozone and old oil. As he climbed down, rung by rung, the temperature began to change. The Valyrians kept the ship at a brisk, comfortable 15 degrees Celsius. They were cold-blooded, or near enough, and relied on environmental suits to regulate their heat if things got too warm. But as Jonathan descended past Deck 6, the chill vanished. The air grew heavy, stifling. By the time his boots hit the grated floor of the engineering observation deck, he was sweating. He stepped out of the shaft and leaned against the railing, panting. His knee throbbed a steady, rhythmic pulse of pain. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing grime across his cheek. The observation deck overlooked the main reactor room. Below him, the dark matter core sat inside a massive, reinforced cylinder. Normally, the cylinder hummed with a cool blue light. Now, It was glowing a dull, angry cherry red, radiating waves of heat that distorted the air in the room below. Jonathan walked over to the chief engineer's console. The Valerian engineer, a tall, twitchy guy Jonathan only knew as Boss Bird, had left in a hurry. A stylized stylus was snapped in half on the desk. Jonathan pulled up the diagnostic screen. The English translation crawled across the glass. Ambient temperature in core room, 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Warning: lethal environment for Valerian biology. Automated coolant valves. Unresponsive. Manual override required. Jonathan read the screen twice. Then he let out a short, barking laugh that echoed in the empty room. "You've got to be kidding me." He looked down at the red-hot reactor, then back at the screen. The math suddenly made perfect, infuriating sense. The primary coolant loop had jammed. The automated systems couldn't clear it. To fix it, someone had to physically walk down into the core room and pull the manual release lever to flush the system and reboot the flow. But the ambient temperature down there had spiked to 45 degrees Celsius. To a Valerian, 45 degrees wasn't uncomfortable. It was a death sentence. Their proteins would literally begin to denature. They would suffer heat stroke and organ failure within minutes. The engineering crew had seen the temperature spike, realized they couldn't survive the walk to the manual override, and initiated the evacuation protocol. They couldn't fix it, so they assumed nobody could fix it. They had abandoned a multi-billion credit dreadnought, left their janitor to die, and doomed the ship. Why? Because it was 113 degrees. Jonathan shook his head. He grew up in Houston, Texas. He had worked roofing jobs in July where the ambient temperature pushed 110 and the tar under his boots hit 130. 113 degrees, Jonathan muttered, unzipping his heavy, insulated jumpsuit. "You giant, scaly cowards." He peeled the jumpsuit off, leaving him in a stained white undershirt, his heavy canvas work trousers, and steel-toed boots. The air in the observation deck was already hovering around 35 degrees, and the sweat was beginning to pool in the small of his back and run down his ribs. He walked to the edge of the glass and looked down. The manual override was clearly marked, a massive yellow lever attached to the primary coolant pipe, about 50 yards from the entrance of the core room. It looked simple. Walk in, pull lever, save ship, don't die. But as Jonathan stared at the cherry-red cylinder, the cynical part of his brain, the part that kept him alive through 2 divorces and a lifetime of dead-end jobs, kicked in. If it was just a matter of pulling a lever, the automated actuators would have done it before they fried. The valve wasn't just stuck, it was seized. The intense heat from the localized friction, or the failing core, had likely warped the casing. He wasn't going to be able to just pull it. He was going to have to break it loose. Jonathan turned back to his toolkit. He dumped it out onto the clean, pristine floor of the Valerian engineering bay. Wrenches, screwdrivers, a roll of thermal tape, a heavy steel pry bar, and the handle of his mop. He picked up the mop handle. It was solid titanium alloy, light but practically unbreakable. He unscrewed the sponge head and tossed it aside. He picked up the roll of thermal tape and began wrapping it around one end of the pole, creating a thick, insulated grip. His hands were shaking again. He stopped, staring at his own palms. They were calloused, scarred from years of manual labor. "Just a plumbing job, Artie," he whispered to himself. "Biggest, angriest toilet you've ever plunged. That's all." He strapped his heavy leather work gloves to his belt, gripped the customized pry bar in his right hand, and headed for the stairwell that led down into the belly of the beast. Time to containment breach. 28 minutes. The blast doors to the core room were sealed. Thick slabs of composite metal meant to keep radiation and heat contained. Jonathan hit the manual release panel. The doors didn't slide open smoothly. They shuddered, groaning against the warped tracks, before parting just enough for him to squeeze through. The heat hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just warm. It was an aggressive, suffocating wall of thermal energy. It felt like standing directly in front of an open oven door, but the oven was the size of a cathedral. The air was dry, pulling the moisture from Jonathan's eyes and throat the second he stepped inside. He immediately tasted salt as sweat poured down his forehead and straight into his mouth. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of his steel-toed boots on the grating was deafening in the cavernous space. The massive dark matter cylinder dominated the center of the room, humming with a violent, unstable frequency that vibrated right through Jonathan's boots and into his teeth. "Jesus," Jonathan rasped, coughing. The air burned his lungs. He kept his head down, shielding his face with his free forearm, and marched toward the coolant junction. 50 yards felt like a mile. With every step, the heat intensified. 45 degrees at the door, 48 degrees by the outer railing. By the time he reached the primary coolant loop beneath the reactor, the ambient temperature had to be pushing 55 degrees Celsius, over 130 Fahrenheit. Jonathan's undershirt was soaked through, clinging to his chest like a second skin. His vision swam at the edges, the world blurring from a combination of sweat in his eyes and the literal distortion of the superheated air. He reached the junction. The coolant pipe was massive, 3 feet in diameter, covered in thick thermal shielding. But the manual override valve, the large yellow lever, was exposed. Jonathan reached out to grab it, but hesitated. He pulled the thick leather work gloves from his belt and pulled them on. He gripped the yellow lever and pulled down. Nothing. It felt like it was welded to the pipe. "Come on," he grunted, planting his boots firmly on the grating. He pulled harder, putting his back into it. The muscles in his forearms strained, his left knee screaming in protest as he leveraged his weight. The lever didn't move a millimeter. Jonathan let go, stumbling backward, gasping for air. The heat was becoming unbearable. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt dizzy. The early signs of heat exhaustion were creeping in. Nausea, lightheadedness, a chilling sensation despite the furnace around him. He knelt down, getting closer to the valve to inspect it. The metal casing housing the internal butterfly valve had warped. The heat had expanded the alloy, wedging the valve shut. No amount of pulling by hand was going to move it. The friction lock was absolute. "Son of a..." Jonathan coughed, spitting onto the grating. The spit sizzled and evaporated instantly. He looked at his watch. 18 minutes. He needed leverage, mechanical advantage. Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." Jonathan just needed to move a stubborn piece of alien plumbing. He grabbed the titanium mop handle he'd prepped. He jammed the untaped end into the small gap behind the yellow lever, wedging it tightly against the reinforced casing of the main pipe. He created a makeshift lever, using the pipe itself as the fulcrum. He wrapped his gloved hands around the tape-thickened end of the pole. "Okay, you bastard," Jonathan growled, his voice raw. "Let's see who breaks first." He threw his entire body weight forward, pushing down on the pole. The titanium bowed. It bent under the pressure, transferring hundreds of pounds of torque directly into the back of the warped lever. Jonathan gritted his teeth, a low animal sound tearing from his throat. His boots slipped on the grating, slick with his own dripping sweat. He repositioned his feet, ignoring the sharp stabbing pain in his bad knee. He pushed. Creak. A sound. A horrible metallic screech echoed through the hot air. "Move!" Jonathan screamed. He wasn't thinking about the ship anymore. He wasn't thinking about the Valerians, or the vacuum of space, or the impending explosion. He was entirely focused on the inch of metal in front of him. It was a personal insult. A blue-collar war against a stubborn machine. He pushed harder. His leather glove slipped on the tape. His knuckles slammed directly into the superheated outer casing of the coolant pipe. He smelled burning leather and searing flesh before he felt the pain. "Ah!" Jonathan yanked his hand back. The back of his glove was smoking. He tore it off, exposing an ugly red burn across his knuckles. The skin was instantly blistering. He stared at his hand. The pain was sharp, electric. He looked up at the core. The cherry-red glow was turning white. The humming was no longer a vibration. It was a physical pressure pressing against his eardrums. 12 minutes. Jonathan looked at his burned hand, then back at the pole. He didn't put the glove back on. He grabbed the pole with his bare, blistered hand, the pain shooting up his arm like a spike. He grabbed it with his good hand. He planted his boots on the grating, fully committing. He didn't just push this time. He threw himself downward, putting the entire kinetic mass of a stubborn, pissed-off human being behind the titanium rod. Screech crack! The warped metal of the casing gave way. The yellow lever snapped downward, slamming into the open position with a concussive thud that shook the floor plates. Instantly, the massive pipe beneath him groaned. A deep rushing sound roared through the metal, the sound of thousands of gallons of super-chilled synthetic liquid nitrogen rushing past the bottleneck and flooding into the reactor core. Jonathan collapsed backward onto the grating, his chest heaving, his vision spotting with black stars. Above him, the blinding white light of the core flickered. The violent humming stuttered, then slowly, agonizingly began to pitch downward. A massive blast of cold steam vented from a relief pipe near the ceiling, raining down over Jonathan. He lay there, staring up at the metal rafters, letting the freezing condensation mix with his sweat and wash over his blistering hand. The ambient temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in 5 seconds. The automated warning voice of the ship's computer cut through the hissing steam, returning to a calm, measured tone. Coolant loop C, restored. Core temperature, decreasing. Containment breach, averted. Jonathan closed his eyes. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like he wanted to vomit, take a shower, and sleep for a week. "You're welcome, you scaly bastards," he whispered to the empty room. He slowly rolled onto his side, cradling his burned hand against his chest. The ship was quiet again, but this time it was the right kind of quiet, the steady, powerful thrum of a living machine. Now all he had to do was figure out how to drive a Kalen dreadnought back to a human spaceport. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, the janitor was going on break. The synthetic liquid nitrogen venting from the overhead pipes turned the air into a biting, unnatural fog. It settled against Jonathan's skin, rapidly cooling the sweat that had soaked through his undershirt. A violent shiver racked his heavy frame, jarring his burned hand. A sharp, hissing breath escaped his teeth. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind the ugly, throbbing reality of his body. His left knee felt tight, swollen tight against the coarse fabric of his work trousers. But that was a dull ache, an old companion. The back of his right hand was a fresh, screaming agony. He sat up slowly on the grated floor, the titanium mop handle rolling away with a hollow clatter. He pulled his hand close to his chest, bringing it into the dim amber light of the emergency bulbs. The skin across his knuckles was a mottled, angry red, already weeping clear fluid. In the center, a thick, yellowing blister the size of a $50 had formed, the margins raw and puckered. He could smell it, a faint, sickening odor of cooked meat and melted leather. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut. Okay, medbay. Walk it off, Artie. Getting to his feet was a clumsy, pathetic affair. He rolled onto his good side, planted his left boot, and used the railing to haul his 220-pound frame upward. His knee locked, protesting the movement with a sharp grind of cartilage. He leaned heavily against the cold metal railing, panting, the cold steam swirling around his ankles. The sovereign dawn was silent. The deep, rhythmic vibration of the dark matter engines had completely ceased. The ship wasn't flying, it was drifting. 1 billion tons of dead weight floating through the absolute zero of the void. He unclipped the heavy flashlight from his tool belt, flicking it on. The harsh white beam cut through the amber gloom, illuminating the long, ascending maintenance shaft he had to climb to get out of Sector 7. Should have let it burn, he grumbled, taking the first step. It took him 40 minutes to reach Deck 3. He climbed with one hand, hooking his right elbow over the rusted rungs to avoid putting pressure on the burn. By the time he reached the corridor, he was wheezing, his chest tight, his mouth tasting of old pennies. The air up here was back to the standard Valerian 15 degrees Celsius. Without his insulated jumpsuit, the chill gnawed at his damp skin. He dragged his boots down the hallway toward Med Bay Alpha. The pneumatic doors were slightly ajar, stalled on their tracks when the power grid shifted to emergency reserves. Jonathan wedged his shoulder into the gap and pushed. The door ground against the frame, screaming in protest, before sliding open just enough for him to squeeze his broad shoulders through. The medical bay smelled intensely of ozone and a sharp, minty astringent. The Valerians didn't use beds. They used contoured metallic slabs designed to support their ridged spines. Cabinets of thick, frosted glass lined the walls. Jonathan walked over to the nearest cabinet. Locked. An electronic keypad pulsed with a dull red light beside the handle. He didn't have medical clearance. He was Class 4 sanitation. Jonathan stared at the keypad, then looked down at his throbbing hand. The blister had popped somewhere during the climb, and the raw dermis was exposed, weeping sluggishly. The pain was making his stomach roll. He reached into his back pocket with his left hand, pulling out a heavy, steel-handled flathead screwdriver. Clearance overridden, he muttered. He jammed the flathead into the seam between the glass and the metal frame, right below the locking mechanism. He braced his hip against the cabinet and levered the handle sideways. The metal bent. The reinforced glass groaned. Jonathan threw his weight into it. Crack! The locking pin snapped and the door swung open, shattering a small pane of glass that rained down onto the tile floor. He rummaged through the supplies with his good hand, Everything was labeled in the spiky, aggressive Valerian script. He knocked aside tubes of black paste and vials of iridescent liquid until he found a familiar white, rectangular box. Human Standard Trauma Kit. The Valerians kept them on hand for visiting dignitaries, or, evidently, the occasional disposable contractor. Jonathan dragged the box onto one of the metallic medical slabs and popped the latches. He found a canister of derm spray. The label warned of localized discomfort. Jonathan bit down on his lower lip and sprayed a thick, foamy layer over his knuckles. It felt like someone had plunged his hand into a vat of boiling acid. Jonathan let out a guttural roar, dropping the canister. It clattered across the floor, spinning wildly. He doubled over, clutching his wrist, squeezing his eyes shut as stars danced across his vision. The burn was absolute, consuming his entire focus for 10 agonizing seconds. Then the foam hardened into a stiff, translucent gel. The fire vanished, replaced by a deep, unnatural numbness. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, wiping spit from his chin with his shoulder. "Localized discomfort," he wheezed. "Liars." He wrapped the gelled hand clumsily in a roll of sterile gauze, securing it with a strip of standard white medical tape. It looked like a poorly made club, but the pain was gone. Jonathan sat heavily on the edge of the metal slab. The cold seeped through his trousers. He looked around the sterile, brightly lit room. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. No hum of the recyclers, no footsteps in the hall, just him, alone in a metal tube, millions of miles from the nearest blue sky. He rested his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his good hand. A profound, crushing exhaustion washed over him. He missed the smell of cheap coffee in the maintenance break room. He missed the annoying rhythmic clicking of his supervisor's claws on the floorboards. He even missed his ex-wife's incessant complaining about his work hours. He sat there for a long time, listening to the shallow, ragged sound of his own breathing. But the ship was getting colder, and the lights overhead flickered again, the amber dimming slightly. Jonathan lowered his hand. Emergency power wasn't infinite. If the life support recyclers shut down, he would suffocate in the dark. If the thermal regulators died, he would freeze solid. He had saved the ship from burning. Now he had to stop it from dying. He stood up, grabbing the heavy flashlight. He needed to get to the bridge. The bridge of the Sovereign Dawn was located at the very prow of the dreadnought, a sprawling, multi-tiered amphitheater of polished black metal and holographic displays. When the heavy blast-proof doors parted for Jonathan, the sheer scale of the room made him feel incredibly small. Unlike the chaotic mess in the dining hall, the bridge was immaculate. The Valerian command staff had evacuated with chilling efficiency. Terminals were locked down, screens were wiped clean of tactical data, and the primary consoles were powered off. The only source of light came from the massive, curved forward viewport. Jonathan walked slowly toward the glass. His boots clicked softly against the deck. Outside, the universe was spread out in absolute, terrifying indifference. Without the ship's engines running, the stars weren't streaks of white light. They were just static, cold pinpricks in a pitch-black ocean. A sprawling nebula, bruised purple and sickly green, dominated the lower left quadrant of the view. It was beautiful. It made Jonathan want to throw up. He turned his back on the window and looked at the captain's chair. It sat on a raised dais in the center of the room. It was tall, angular, and lacked any real cushioning. Designed for the rigid physiology of Captain Rice, a Valyrian who stood nearly 7 feet tall and treated Jonathan like a piece of faulty machinery. Jonathan walked up the 3 short steps to the dais and sat down. His feet barely touched the floor. The hard, ergonomic ridges dug uncomfortably into his spine and shoulder blades. He shifted, trying to find a comfortable position, but there wasn't one. It was a chair built for command, not comfort. He leaned forward, looking at the primary console embedded in the armrests. The screens were black. "All right," Jonathan said, the sound of his voice startling him in the vast, quiet room. "Let's see what you left me, Rice." He tapped the center of the glass screen. A small, pulsing blue prompt appeared. It demanded an alphanumeric sequence, a command-level password. Jonathan scoffed. "Yeah, I don't have that." He pulled a small, battered data pad from his tool belt. It was his maintenance issue device, loaded with schematic blueprints and cleaning schedules. He unspooled a short physical wire from the base of the pad and plugged it into the diagnostic port hidden under the lip of the captain's armrest. He wasn't a hacker. He didn't know how to crack military-grade encryption, but he knew how the ship's internal network was wired. Sanitation had to have lower-level access to every room on the ship to clear the trash incinerator chutes. The system viewed him not as a user, but as a utility process. He typed his employee ID into his datapad, Paul A. 4492. He didn't try to access the weapons array, the navigation logs, or the classified cargo manifest. He selected the basic environmental and intercom subsystems. The ship's computer, recognizing a valid utility request, bypassed the command lock for those specific modules. The console hummed, and the screens flared to life, washing Jonathan's tired face in a pale, blue glow. He pulled up the ship's current status. The dark matter core was stable, resting at a safe thermal baseline, but the primary engines were completely offline. The Valyrians hadn't just shut them down, they had initiated a hard, physical disconnect to prevent the core breach from causing an engine cascade failure. Jonathan tapped the screen, navigating to the external sensors. Velocity, 0.003 C. Trajectory, drifting. Nearest habitable system, 4.2 light years. 4.2 light years. Without the dark matter drive, at his current drifting speed, it would take him roughly 140,000 years to get there. Jonathan stared at the number. He rubbed his eyes with his good hand, feeling the grit and grime ground into his pores. He minimized the window and opened the communication logs. He needed to send an SOS. He needed to tell someone, anyone, that the Sovereign Dawn hadn't detonated. He found the automated evacuation report. It was a cold, sterile document, generated the moment the escape pods launched. Total pods deployed, 42. Command staff evacuated, 100%. Engineering staff evacuated, 100%. Support staff evacuated, 100%. Jonathan frowned. He scrolled down. Casualties, 0. Assets abandoned, 1. Classification, biological/maintenance. ID, Paul, Jonathan. Reason for abandonment, non-essential. Outside safe evacuation, radius. He read the words 3 times. Assets abandoned. Not crew, not human. An asset. A broom that had been left in the closet while the house burned down. A tight, bitter laugh bubbled up in his chest. It echoed off the polished metal walls, sounding thin and fragile. He tapped the comms icon, intending to broadcast a wide-band distress signal, A red warning box flashed on the screen. Communications, array, hardware lockout. Protocol 81. Secures all external broadcasts to prevent enemy interception of distress coordinates. Manual reboot required at external array. Jonathan slumped back against the rigid, uncomfortable chair. Protocol 81A. The total evacuation protocol. When they abandoned ship, the computer automatically locked down the communication array. The Valyrians were at war with a splinter faction of the Kalan Empire. They didn't want a drifting, intact dreadnought screaming its location into the void for scavengers or enemies to find. To unlock the comms, someone had to physically go outside, onto the exterior hull of the ship, and manually reset the hardware breaker on the main transmitter dish. Jonathan looked out the massive forward window at the cold, endless expanse of space. He had no training for zero-gravity walks. He had never worn a vacuum suit. He was a 50-year-old janitor with a bad knee, a burned hand, and zero flight experience. He looked back at the screen, at the word abandoned. He could wait. The emergency power would keep the life support running for maybe 2 weeks. He could eat the dry nutrient paste in the mess hall, sleep in the captain's chair, and quietly fade away when the oxygen scrubbers finally died. It would be peaceful. Jonathan unstrapped the heavy leather work glove from his belt, the one that wasn't burned. He tossed it onto the console. It landed with a dull, heavy thud against the pristine glass. "Non-essential my ass," he whispered. He stood up, his knee popping loudly in the quiet room. He grabbed his datapad and unplugged it. He needed to find the airlock, and he needed to find a suit that fit a human. The broom wasn't done sweeping yet. The auxiliary airlock on Deck 2 smelled intensely of stale talcum powder and cold synthetic rubber. It was a cramped, utilitarian space lined with heavy metal lockers, a far cry from the sleek, polished aesthetic of the bridge. Jonathan limped into the room, leaning heavily on the doorframe. The painkillers from the trauma kit hadn't kicked in fully, or maybe they just weren't designed for human neurochemistry. Either way, his left knee was a tight, throbbing knot, and the gelled club of his right hand pulsed with a dull, sickening rhythm. He keyed open the primary lockers. Empty. The Valyrians had taken their sleek, form-fitting EVA suits when they abandoned ship. "Course they did," Jonathan muttered. He moved to the back of the room, to a dusty caged alcove labeled non-standard biometric. He yanked the cage door open. Inside, hanging limp like a discarded skin, was a human standard emergency vacuum suit. It was bright, obnoxious safety orange. Jonathan stared at it. It looked heavy, outdated, and excessively padded. A bulky white helmet with a wide, scratched gold visor rested on the shelf above it. It wasn't designed for repair work. It was designed to keep a fragile human contractor alive just long enough to be rescued if the hull breached. He pulled it off the rack. It weighed at least 40 pounds. "All right, Artie," he whispered to the empty room. "Time to put on the clown suit." Getting into the suit was a miserable, exhausting wrestling match. The material was stiff and unforgiving. He had to sit on the cold metal bench, groaning as he shoved his legs into the thick, insulated trousers, his bad knee screaming as the rigid fabric forced it to bend. Then came the upper half. He wriggled his left arm through the heavy sleeve, the locking ring at the wrist digging into his skin, but his right hand, the burned, gel-wrapped, gauze-covered club, wouldn't fit through the narrow wrist seal of the suit's integrated glove. Jonathan sat there, chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead again. He couldn't go out there without the glove sealed. The vacuum of space would boil his blood in seconds. He grabbed his heavy flathead screwdriver from his tool belt, which now sat on the floor. He jammed the flat metal head into the inner lining of the suit's right wrist seal, prying at the thick rubber gasket to stretch it. He braced the suit against his thighs and pulled, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The rubber groaned, stretching just a fraction of an inch. "Come on," he hissed. He dropped the screwdriver, grabbed his wrapped hand with his good hand, and forced it into the sleeve. The compression was immediate and agonizing. The stretched rubber seal scraped over the gauze, squeezing the raw, blistered skin underneath the hardened derm gel. Jonathan let out a sharp, breathless string of profanities, kicking the metal bench in blind frustration. The pain flared up his arm, bright and blinding, but the hand popped through. The seal snapped back, clamping tight around his forearm. He was in. He stood up, feeling clumsy and top-heavy. The suit hugged him awkwardly, too tight across his broad shoulders and too loose around his waist. He reached up and hauled the heavy white helmet off the shelf. He paused, looking at his reflection in the scratched gold visor. He looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, his face smeared with grease and dried sweat. He didn't look like an astronaut. He looked like a tired old man who had taken a wrong turn in a hardware store. He lowered the helmet over his head. The locking collar engaged with a heavy metallic clunk, followed by the sharp hiss of the suit's internal pressurization system kicking on. Instantly, his world shrank. The ambient silence of the dead ship was replaced by the loud, rhythmic rasp of his own breathing and the whir of the suit's oxygen scrubbers. The air inside smelled faintly of ozone and old sweat, someone else's sweat. He tapped the control pad on his left forearm. The heavy magnetic locks in the soles of his boots activated. Clack. He lifted his foot. It felt like it was encased in concrete. Clack. He took a step toward the inner airlock door. He dragged his steel tether line from the wall rack, clipping the heavy carabiner to the solid metal D-ring on his chest harness. He slapped the large green button beside the heavy blast door. The door slid open, revealing the small cylindrical chamber of the airlock. Jonathan stepped inside. Clack, clack. He turned and hit the panel to close the inner door. It sealed with a heavy thud, locking him in. The automated voice of the ship's computer crackled directly into his helmet earpiece, the English translation sounding metallic and distorted. Depressurization commencing. Secure all tethers. Jonathan hooked the other end of his tether to the steel rail running along the floor of the airlock. He swallowed hard. His mouth was completely dry. The air began to vent. He could feel the pressure dropping, the suit stiffening around him as it compensated, turning into a rigid balloon. The sound of the venting air faded from a loud rush to a faint whisper, and then absolute, terrifying silence. Sound could no longer travel through the vacuum in the room. He could only hear the internal workings of his suit and his own rapid heartbeat. A red light above the outer door turned green. Jonathan placed his good hand on the manual wheel of the outer hatch. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting like recycled plastic. Just a walk on the roof, he lied to himself. He turned the wheel. The outer hatch swung open outward, pulling Jonathan forward as the last microscopic traces of atmosphere escaped into the void. He gripped the door frame, stopping his momentum. He looked out. There was no up. There was no down. There was only the infinite, crushing expanse of black, punctuated by the cold, uncaring light of distant stars. To his left, the sprawling purple and green nebula he had seen from the bridge looked infinitely more massive, an angry bruise across the cosmos. A wave of vertigo hit him so hard his knees buckled. His stomach vaulted into his chest. He closed his eyes tightly, clutching the metal frame of the hatch until his knuckles ached through the thick gloves. "Don't look at the sky," he commanded himself, his voice sounding hollow inside the helmet. "Look at the floor. Look at the ship." He opened his eyes and forced his gaze downward, focusing on the dark gray textured metal of the Sovereign Dawn's exterior hull. He stepped out of the airlock. His right boot touched the hull. The magnetic sole engaged automatically. It didn't make a sound in the vacuum, but he felt the vibration through his leg, a solid, reassuring thump. He brought his left foot down. Thump. He was standing on the outside of the ship. Jonathan unclipped his tether from the airlock rail and locked it onto the exterior safety line that ran the length of the dreadnought's spine. He gave it a hard tug. It held. He looked up toward the bow of the ship. The main communications array was a massive, dish-like structure mounted about 200 yards away, jutting out from the ship's sloping hull like a giant metallic flower. 200 yards. On solid ground, it was a 2-minute walk. Out here, fighting the stiffness of the pressurized suit, the magnetic boots, and the sheer terror of the void, it might as well have been a marathon. He took his first step. It was agonizingly slow. He had to physically wrench his foot upward against the magnetic pull, slide it forward, and slam it down. Step, drag, thump. As he cleared the shadow of the ship's superstructure, the local star crested the horizon of the hull. The light was blinding, harsh, and unfiltered by any atmosphere. It slammed into him like a physical force. Instantly, the right side of his suit began to heat up, the internal temperature warning flashing a dull yellow on his visor's heads-up display. The left side of his body, still cast in the pitch-black shadow of his own bulk, remained freezing cold. "Come on, you cheap piece of junk," Jonathan grunted, tapping his chest plate to try and force the suit's thermal regulators to catch up. The fans inside the helmet whined higher, struggling to balance the extreme temperature differential. Step, drag, thump. His left knee was screaming. The repetitive, heavy lifting required to break the magnetic seal with every step was grinding the damaged cartilage to dust. He was sweating profusely again, the moisture pooling uncomfortably at the base of his neck, unable to evaporate in the confined space of the helmet. He kept his eyes locked on the comms dish. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He just watched the metal grating of the hull slide agonizingly slow beneath his boots. He felt a sudden, sharp tug at his waist. He froze. He looked back. The heavy steel tether had snagged on a raised thermal tile about 10 yards behind him. "You've got to be kidding me," Jonathan wheezed. He tried to flick the line, hoping to create a wave that would dislodge it. The thick, insulated cable barely moved. He had to go back. He turned clumsily, his heavy boots fighting his momentum. He took a step back toward the snag. As he planted his left foot, his knee finally gave out. The joint collapsed with a sickening pop that he felt all the way up his spine. Jonathan pitched forward. His right boot lost its magnetic grip as his angle shifted violently. He fell face first toward the hull. He threw his hands out instinctively. His left hand hit the metal, the magnetic palm pad locking on. But his right hand, The bulky, stiff glove encasing his burned flesh glanced off a curved sensor node. His body swung around the pivot point of his left hand. The momentum ripped his boots entirely free from the hull. Suddenly, Jonathan was floating. He was suspended over the absolute abyss, dangling by one arm, his legs kicking uselessly in the vacuum. The stars spun wildly in his vision. Panic, cold and absolute, seized his throat. He couldn't breathe. The massive dark belly of the ship loomed above him, and below was nothing, endless nothing. "No, no, no," he gasped, his voice cracking. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to flail. Flailing in zero gravity was a death sentence. It just created spin. He forced himself to freeze. He opened his eyes. He looked at his left arm, stretched taut, the magnetic glove holding firmly to the hull. He looked down at his waist. The tether was still attached, though currently slack. He took a slow, jagged breath, tasting the ozone. "You're okay, Artie," he whispered, his chest heaving. "You're tethered. You're holding on. You're just taking a really weird break." He swung his body slightly, using his core muscles, penduluming his legs back toward the hull. His right boot struck the metal. The magnet engaged with a heavy vibration. Thump. Jonathan let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He pulled his left leg down. Thump. He lay flat against the hull for a long minute, his helmet pressed against the cold metal, feeling the vibration of his own ragged breathing. "Okay," he grunted. "Break's over." He unsnagged the tether, turned back around, and resumed his slow, agonizing march. Step, drag, thump. When he finally reached the base of the communications array, he was utterly spent. His muscles were trembling, and his right hand was throbbing with a fresh, sharp agony from the pressure of the suit. The base of the dish housed the manual override panel. It was a simple, latch-secured metal box. Jonathan locked his boots to the hull and leaned against the base of the dish to take the weight off his bad leg. He reached out with his left hand and popped the two latches. The panel floated open. Inside was a series of heavy breaker switches. The primary array lock was marked with a strip of red tape. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He didn't want to be out here a second longer than necessary. He jammed his left thumb against the heavy switch and pushed it upward. It clicked into place. Instantly, the metal beneath his boots vibrated. A deep, powerful hum transmitted through the soles of his suit. He looked up. The massive dish above him slowly began to pivot, orienting itself away from the local star and out into the deep void, coming alive as the lockdown protocols disengaged. Jonathan dropped his head back, staring up at the dish. A single bead of sweat broke free from his eyebrow and floated uselessly in the microgravity of the helmet, sticking to the inside of his visor. "Comms are up," he said to the empty universe. He looked back the way he had come. The airlock looked miles away. The walk back was going to be worse. "Janitor of the Year," Jonathan muttered. He turned around, dragged his heavy right foot forward, and began the long walk home. The walk back to the airlock didn't take 20 minutes. It took an hour. Jonathan's world narrowed down to the scratched gold tint of his visor and the repetitive bone-grinding rhythm of his boots. Step, drag, thump. He stopped counting the steps. He stopped looking at the stars. He even stopped swearing. There wasn't enough oxygen left in his blood for anger. The suit's internal temperature gauge had flatlined, the environmental regulators completely overwhelmed by the alternating extremes of hard solar radiation and the absolute zero of the ship's shadow. The right side of his body felt like it was baking in a low-grade oven. The left side was numb, a deep, aching cold that penetrated straight into his joints. When his glove finally wrapped around the manual wheel of the outer airlock hatch, he didn't feel a surge of triumph. He just felt an overwhelming, heavy desire to lie down and die. He cranked the wheel. His burned hand screamed beneath the gel, a sharp tearing sensation as the blistered skin rubbed against the thick rubber of the suit. He ignored it. He shoved the hatch open, dragged his heavy frame inside, and hit the inner seal button with his elbow. The outer door clamped shut. The repressurization sequence was violent. The air rushed back into the cramped chamber with a deafening roar. Jonathan's ears popped, a sharp spike of pain shooting through his sinuses. The rigid suit instantly deflated, going slack around him like a punctured tire. His knees buckled. He didn't try to stop the fall. He just let gravity take him, collapsing backward onto the cold metal grating of the airlock floor. He reached up with trembling, uncoordinated fingers, fumbling with the locking collar of the helmet. He twisted it hard, hearing the hiss-clack of the seal breaking, and shoved the heavy dome off his head. It rolled away, bouncing dully against the locker. Jonathan took a breath. Real air. It tasted like ozone, stale talcum powder, and his own sour, unwashed sweat. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He lay there for 10 minutes, his chest heaving, his eyes closed. The silence of the ship wrapped around him. He had done it. The comms were open. Getting out of the suit was an ugly, desperate struggle. He didn't bother hanging it up. He peeled it down to his waist, kicked his boots free with agonizing effort, and dragged his left arm out. He left his right arm, the burned one, inside the sleeve, simply cutting the rubber cuff with a pair of trauma shears from the medical kit he'd stashed in his pocket, sacrificing the suit to spare his blistered flesh. He stumbled out of the airlock, his clothes soaked, his hair matted to his forehead. He looked like a man who had just crawled out of a shipwreck. He limped back to the bridge. The amphitheater was just as he had left it, cast in the pale blue glow of the unlocked primary console. The massive forward viewport showed the same indifferent, star-streaked void. But this time, when Jonathan plugged his battered datapad back into the armrest port, the red warning box didn't appear. The communications array was fully online. He collapsed into the rigid, angular captain's chair. His bad knee pulsed with a dull, rhythmic throb that matched his heartbeat. He leaned forward, wiping a smear of grime off the touchscreen with his good thumb. He selected the wideband emergency frequency. It was a universal channel, monitored by every civilized species in the sector. "All right," Jonathan rasped. His throat was incredibly dry. He coughed, clearing the thick mucus from his chest, and tapped the broadcast icon. A green recording light flared on the console. He stared at the light. He didn't know military protocols. He didn't know the proper distress codes. "This is Jonathan Paul," he said, his voice flat and heavy in the empty room. "Employee ID, 4492, Class 4 Sanitation. I am currently aboard the Valerian dreadnought Sovereign Dawn." He paused, licking his cracked lips. "The ship experienced a critical coolant failure in the dark matter core. The entire crew evacuated. They left me behind, deemed me a non-essential asset." Jonathan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Anyway, the core didn't breach. I wedged a titanium mop handle into the manual override and flushed the system. Ship is stable, engines are hard locked offline, but life support is running on emergency reserves. He leaned back against the uncomfortable chair, staring out at the nebula. I'm adrift. No propulsion, no navigation. I have about a week's worth of awful purple paste and some water. If there's anyone out there listening, I'm a human citizen. I'd really appreciate a tow, and maybe a ride home. He reached out and tapped the console. Message recorded. Broadcasting on continuous loop. Jonathan stared at the screen for a long time. The signal was out there, traveling at the speed of light into the dark. He unplugged his datapad, stood up slowly, and turned away from the stars. He was going to find the captain's private quarters, drink whatever expensive alien liquor was hidden in the desk, and sleep for a very long time. 3 days. 72 hours of absolute crushing isolation. Jonathan spent the first day sleeping in a bed designed for a creature with a rigid spine, waking up with cramps that made his teeth grind. He spent the second day raiding the officers' mess, discovering that Valerian High Command ate the exact same tasteless, nutrient-dense paste as the grunts, just in nicer bowls. By the third day, the silence was making him crazy. To cope, he did what he had done for the last 30 years of his life. He worked. He found a spare mop in a Deck 2 supply closet. He mixed a bucket of standard synthetic lemon solvent. He went back to the bridge, and he started scrubbing the deck. It wasn't about the dirt. The bridge was spotless. It was about the rhythmic, predictable motion. Swoosh, ring, swoosh, ring. It was control. He was halfway across the upper command tier, his burned hand heavily bandaged and taped to his chest to keep it immobilized, when the proximity klaxon finally sounded. Beep, 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 beep. Jonathan froze, the mop suspended over the bucket. He dropped the handle. It hit the deck with a loud clatter. He hobbled down the 3 steps to the captain's dais, his bad knee stiff but functional, and practically fell into the command chair. He brought up the tactical display. A sleek gray chevron was holding position 500 kilometers off the dreadnought's port bow. The transponder code translated into plain, glorious English. UNS Vanguard, Heavy Cruiser, United Nations, Space Command. They were human. A static-laced voice cracked through the bridge's primary speakers. It was a woman's voice, clipped, professional, and undeniably earthborn. Unknown entity aboard the Sovereign Dawn. This is Captain Stone of the UNS Vanguard. We have intercepted your distress beacon. We are tracking 0 thermal output from your main drives. Are you the sole occupant of this vessel? Jonathan reached out, his hand shaking so hard he almost missed the transmit button. Yeah, he breathed. Yeah, it's just me, Paul. Copy that, Paul. We are initiating docking procedures at your starboard auxiliary airlock. Have your hazard suit ready. We don't know the atmospheric integrity of your vessel. Air's fine, Jonathan replied, a tired smile cracking his chapped lips. Smells a bit like lemon, actually. I'll meet you at the door. 20 minutes later, the heavy pneumatic doors of the starboard airlock hissed open. A team of 6 heavily armed Marines spilled into the corridor, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the corners. They wore matte black tactical armor and full-face helmets. They moved with absolute predatory precision. Following closely behind them was a tall, sharp-eyed woman in a crisp gray naval uniform. Captain Stone. She stepped over the threshold, her eyes scanning the dimly lit, amber-hued corridor. She stopped. Standing 10 feet away, leaning heavily against a bulkhead, was Jonathan. He was wearing his stained, ill-fitting blue sanitation jumpsuit. His right hand was wrapped in a massive, ugly ball of gauze and medical tape. He held a half-empty foil pouch of valerian nutrient paste in his left hand. Stone blinked, lowering her sidearm. She looked at his employee badge, then back up to his tired, bloodshot eyes. "You're Jonathan Paul?" she asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "That's me," Jonathan said. He took a bite of the paste, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "Thanks for the lift." Stone stared at him. "Mr. Paul, our tactical scans show this dreadnought suffered a Class 5 coolant failure. The entire Valerian command structure abandoned ship because the core room reached lethal temperatures." "How are you still alive? How did the core not breach?" Jonathan sighed. He pointed his half-eaten pouch of paste down the corridor toward the maintenance shafts leading to Sector 7. "The automated valve seized up because of the heat," Jonathan explained, his voice flat. "The geckos couldn't take the temperature, so they ran. I went down there and popped the manual release." One of the Marines, a massive guy carrying a heavy repeater, scoffed behind his visor. "The manual release on a Kalen-class dreadnought requires 3 tons of mechanical force to actuate if the housing warps. You didn't just pop it, old man." Jonathan looked at the Marine. He felt a familiar, blue-collar irritation flare in his chest. It was the same look the Valerian engineers used to give him when he told them their shiny new recyclers were clogged with their own shed scales. "Well, I didn't pull it with my teeth, son," Jonathan said. "I used a lever." Stone frowned. "What kind of lever?" "Titanium mop handle," Jonathan said plainly. "Wrapped the end in thermal tape. Wedged it behind the pipe casing, used my body weight, and broke the friction lock. Blew the coolant loop wide open." Silence fell over the corridor. The Marines exchanged glances. Stone just stared at him, her jaw muscles working as she tried to process the sheer, absurd reality of his statement. "You—" Stone started, stopping to compose herself. "You saved a multi-billion credit warship? With a mop handle?" Jonathan looked down at his ruined right hand, the dull throb reminding him of exactly what it had cost. He looked back up at the pristine, untouched uniforms of the human rescue team. "Yeah," Jonathan said. He tossed the empty paste pouch into a nearby receptacle. "And then I had to go outside and manually reset the comms dish because the cowards locked the network when they bolted. So, if you don't mind, Captain, I'm really tired of being on this ship." Stone slowly nodded, a profound respect dawning in her eyes. She tapped her earpiece. "Vanguard Actual, this is Stone. Target is secured. The vessel is intact. Send an engineering team over here. Tell them to head to the main core room." She paused, a faint smirk touching the corner of her mouth. "And tell them not to touch the mop handle. We're taking it back as evidence." She turned back to Jonathan and gestured toward the open airlock of the human cruiser. "Right this way, Mr. Paul. We have a medical bay waiting for you. And real food." Jonathan pushed off the bulkhead. He limped past the heavily armed Marines, the clatter of his steel-toed boots echoing in the quiet corridor. He didn't look back at the sovereign dawn. He had swept his floors. He had plunged their reactor. He was off the clock. "You got any coffee over there?" Jonathan muttered as he crossed the threshold. "Real coffee, not that synthetic crap." "We do, Jonathan," Stone said softly. "As much as you want." Jonathan smiled. A real, genuine smile. For the first time in 3 days, the universe didn't seem so cold. If Jonathan's blue-collar resilience struck a chord with you, hit that like button and let the algorithm know humanity gets the job done. What's the most unconventional fix you've ever pulled off under pressure? Drop your best DIY repair stories in the comments below.